Welcome, everybody. Today's event presents research funded by the Inaugural John W. and Constance P. Reps Award. The award was established by the Reps family in honor of our beloved Professor John Reps and his late wife to support the highest level of research by students in CRP. And we are especially glad that the Reps family is joining us this afternoon. It is appropriate that the award went to today's speaker, Sam Coons, who is a student who's managed to take advantage of almost all that Cornell has to offer, receiving his Bachelor of Science from URS in 2017, and next year receiving both an MRP and MLA degree. And I say that without any worry about whether he actually will or not. Sam's work examines narratives of place in the cities of the Great Lakes. Originally from Rochester, he completed his Bachelor of Science here at Cornell and then went to work at the Center for Regional Economic Advancement at Cornell and the Planning and Development Department in the city of Detroit, as well as with the Arts and Culture program at the Kresge Foundation. So today's research presentation deals with Detroit. And the question is, in the face of pernicious narratives of decline, how do community builders in Detroit, Michigan, use artistic expression to communicate, negotiate, and implement their visions of the future? Scholarship on the role of the arts in community development, increasingly situated within the growing literature on creative placemaking, often focuses on how artists catalyze change in the built environment. Less studied is how the adoption of artistic practices affects the vision and values of community organizers, community development practitioners, and municipal planning staff. So please join me in welcoming Sam Coons.
Thank you, Professor Chusid. I appreciate the introduction. A couple quick points before I jump into talking about my work. The first is that I'll be talking for about 45 minutes, and then I want to open it to a Q&A, to any discussion or questions that people might have. When we get to the end or along the way, if questions arise and you don't want to lose them, if you could just place them in the chat function or raise your blue hand in the participants list, that'll help me a lot when we get to the end, making sure that I can see what questions we have. The other kind of important part that I'd like to mention before I start talking about the work is that this work is ongoing. I'm very grateful to have had the support of this award to really go and talk with practitioners in Detroit and hear what they're saying about the work that they're doing. But I do plan on continuing this work. And so the presentation that you'll be hearing me give is really about me wanting to present several of the conversations that I had and several of the views of the people with which I spoke. So it won't focus quite as much on synthesis or major takeaways. Those are still a work in progress. But I'd be happy to answer questions at the end as to where I see it going or what my initial thoughts may be with that. So I'm going to begin sharing my screen and we can get started. So before I begin talking about my research in Detroit, I'd like to acknowledge this land on which Cornell University operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Cayuga Nation, members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Today, this meeting place that we're in, or we're all in intellectually today, is still home to the Cayuga and indigenous people from across Turtle Island. The work I conducted in Detroit was on the traditional land of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and Wyandot nations, who are members of the Three Fires Confederacy. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to work on those lands, as well as the land here that I continue to work on. I also want to acknowledge the work being done to confront the epidemic of police violence against Black communities in cities across the country, but also specifically in my hometown of Rochester, New York. Today will be the 19th straight day that they've been marching downtown for justice for the murder of Daniel Prude. Close childhood friends of mine have been injured by officers from the Rochester Police Department while they've been peacefully protesting over the past 3 weeks. And nothing this year has been harder for me than watching their bravery and the pain of my neighbors from afar. I bring these acknowledgements up for their own merit, but also to comment on the importance of narrative and community building work. I've thought quite a lot about the similarities between the formation of a narrative and the formation of an identity. Paul Ricoeur argues that humans experience time in iterations, that to make sense of our present and imagine a future, we must make meaning of the disparate events of our past in relation to our present and the future that we imagine in real time. So while cosmological time may describe a linear concept moving from birth to death, phenomenological time, which Ricoeur argues is how we construct our identities, oscillates between past and future to orient where we feel we are now. The stories then that make up our identity, those portions of the past and those imagined futures, then are dynamic. They change and evolve with us, and our identities are dynamic as well. This bears striking similarities to the dialogical self theory in clinical psychology, which explains a similar idea, but located in the conception of the self. The theory suggests that the self is formed through a process of positioning one's idea of themselves against other positions in personal, this external ring, or social, that outside ring space. And that's to say that while we are making our own calibrations of who we feel we are, relative to the past and the future, that we are doing that with other people and other things in our environment. This is all to say that this idea connecting narratives and identities, it also involves our cities. It involves the material presence of our world. So these relationships between our stories and our identities, between they set the stage for one of the main arguments I'm trying to make in this presentation today, that to understand the material culture of our cities, we must situate ourselves and our stories squarely in our inquiry. So we can begin then with the question I received most frequently during my time in Detroit, often partly out of caution, partly out of curiosity. And that question is, why are you here in Detroit? My typical answer involved one of two replies for the most part, that I like it here, that I like Detroit, and that it reminds me of my home. Urban theorists could certainly find common ground between Detroit and Rochester, and for the most part in my academic career, I suppose I fall into this category. Both cities are post-industrial, an urban theorist could say. They both had racial unrest throughout the 20th century, alongside white flight to the suburbs and dramatic population loss. They might comment on the racial discrimination in policing and housing. But to me, the similarities are not that rational. They're felt and they're deeply narrative relating to who I feel I am. I never saw that the city was post-industrial. After all, the suburbs where I lived and was raised seemed to be doing just fine. And the histories of violence and racial difference were mostly just assumed. As a white person, I knew what it was like to grow up around Black families, but no one dared spend time in the Crescent, which is the west and north sides of the city that housed the majority of its Black and Latino population. This was a learned indifference. This was something we were taught. During the brutal crime wave in the early 2000s, the then police chief and later mayor of Rochester and lieutenant governor of New York, Robert Duffy, described the Crescent, these Black and Latino communities, as, quote, a cancerous tumor. The mayor at the time, Bill Johnson, was slightly more tactical in his language, saying, quote, I've heard people talk about the city like it's a cesspool, a hellhole, a place to be avoided. Rochester economically was once defined as the location of the Eastman Kodak Company. Kodak was in many ways the model of the paternal corporation, employing an enormous part of the city's population and throwing its influence across city and suburban policy. Edward Chambers, who worked in Rochester in the 1960s fighting Kodak's racist hiring policies, recalls Saul Alinsky stating, Rochester, New York is a southern plantation transplanted north. While Kodak is still headquartered in the city, its fall from grace in the late 1990s and early 2000s saw the company cut its workforce by over 100,000 employees. Many of these workers had decades of experience and engineering diplomas and had nowhere else to go when the city's economic fabric collapsed and their pensions vanished. It became common in the suburbs to hire a technician for home repairs and have a retirement age ex-Kodak engineer show up for the job. Growing up in a place in free fall is unusual. Rochester was called Smugtown throughout much of the early 20th century in reference to the perceived stability and size of its middle class compared to neighboring cities like Buffalo. I was raised in a Rochester, though, that had lost any illusion of a guaranteed future. I always had the feeling that this was not how it was supposed to be, that a place was not supposed to only face bad news. The material practices of Rochester's urban elites and the professional classes of planners and designers on their payroll, their legacy was defined by erasure, which produced a narrative superstructure in which we all lived. And to my surprise, it is not unique. Detroit lives in a similar narrative superstructure with a similar sudden urgency, stemming from the bailout of the automotive industry in 2008, the loss of a quarter of the city's population from 2000 to 2010, and the city's municipal bankruptcy in 2013. Here at Cornell, almost a third of the students who graduate head to New York City after graduation, a product of a mixture of recruitment practices and personal preferences to live in a place bigger than any other in America. But to me, Detroit had a greater sway that affected me personally. Everything in Detroit was supersized to what I had known most intimately: the population, the neighborhoods, the skyscrapers, and the stories. For me, arriving in Detroit was finding the big city, and I had a lot to learn when I got there. Detroiters' relationships with outsiders is often described as tenuous at best. Last summer, when I was interning with the city's planning and development department, I remember a certain formality that I frequently saw in community meetings. When a resident got up to speak, they would first say three things. They would say their name, their street or neighborhood, and how long they've lived in the city of Detroit. What was partly a tool of legitimizing oneself in the arena of public life was also a sort of dance among the sticking points in Detroit today. How new to Detroit are you? Are you living in Midtown, where the gentrified rents regularly climb upwards of $1,000 for a studio apartment? Are you from the East Side? Are you from the West Side? But for all of the possible hints of one's past that this formality gave, it also set a table for an introduction. Here, in a deliberative space, residents sought to establish some structure of their identities together before negotiating their vision for their city with their neighbors and local government. In 2019, last summer, this was important because in the wake of Detroit's economic and municipal crises of the late 2000s and early 2010s, the wave of headlines, documentaries, photographers, and academics sort of crashed onto the city with fairly rude tact. The art and design world were no different. Tony Barlow, a Detroit-based marketing executive and Brooklyn expat, stirred controversy in 2009 when he wrote in a New York Times op-ed, as we see here, "The city offers a much greater attraction for artists than $100 houses. Detroit right now is just this vast, enormous canvas where anything imaginable can be accomplished. In a way, a strange new American dream can be found here amid the crumbling, semi-majestic ruins of a half-century's industrial decline. The good news is that, almost magically, dreamers are already showing up." Emblematic of this gold rush was the equally controversial United States Pavilion at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale, titled "The Architectural Imagination," which says it exhibited 12, quote, "new speculative architecture projects designed for specific sites in Detroit with far-reaching applications for cities around the world." The exhibition was curated by Cynthia Davidson, a New York-based architecture editor and critic, and Monica Ponce de Leon, the dean of Princeton University's School of Architecture. They stated in the call for proposals, "Detroit was once a center of American imagination, not only for the products it made, cars and music and much more, but also for its modern architecture and modern lifestyle, which captivated artists worldwide. Now, like many post-industrial cities, Detroit is coping with a changed urban density and image that has generated much thinking in urban planning." At the heart of the architectural imagination's call is a false dichotomy between modernity and decay, suggesting that the disinvestment that produced the changes in density and image that they cited implies a loss of collective imagination. This specifically places designers at the forefront of Detroit's past and future vitality, while also disregarding the role of design in its decline. And most concerning, the call gives human agency to architecture without mentioning human Detroiters at all. So architecture and planning wield enormous power. For all the talk about the death of modernism corresponding with the defanging of professional authority among planners and architects, to render your intentions over the lives of others is a massive undertaking, with implications for our democracy that can't be understated. When the barrier to entry to participate in those massive design moves is too high, or when such access is limited through disciplinary gatekeeping, planning and design remain fundamentally elitist. To try to find another perspective, I turned to Kimberly Kinder's work in Detroit on Detroiters' self-provisioning of municipal services, which is essentially in the space where municipal services are cut or are not efficiently provided. It's the actions of neighbors to provide their own strategies to address public safety and public works, among others. So she says, in relation to self-provisioning transformed the social and spatial logic of the city. It created new clustering logics among families and friends. It reinforced some market practices while undermining others. It created informal mechanisms for civic participation among vulnerable social groups. It influenced the citywide distribution of scarce government and nonprofit resources. And it reworked normative expectations about governance, lifestyle, and entitlement. Later in the book, her book, DIY Detroit, she has this other quote, which I find particularly relevant to what we're talking about today. She says, self-provisioning was not an insular process emerging only from the ground up. Instead, it was part of a broad public negotiation over the future of the city. So why then look at art? Charlene Carruthers states that activists leverage stories to explain complex ideas. I would extend their statement further and say that activists often leverage the material resources at hand to physically construct their stories and model alternative futures. There is a rich history of artists working closely with communities in the neighborhoods of Detroit, but those stories are often well documented. There is also a parallel history of graffiti art in the city, particularly in the city's core of downtown, midtown, and New Center and their surroundings. In my research over this summer, I focused on a specific methodology and a specific set of actors. I wanted to learn from the stories of community builders who may not describe themselves as professional artists, but for various reasons chose to bring artistic expression into their work. This is to validate the value of artistic expression outside of the realm of professionals and to surface the ways that art operates beyond its aesthetic or symbolic qualities. Akin to what Suzanne E. Smith describes in her descriptions of King Solomon Baptist Church, a civil rights landmark in the Northwest Goldberg neighborhood. Suzanne Smith writes, King Solomon Baptist Church, with its multifarious roles as religious organization, concert hall, poetry collective, and site for political rallies, illustrated the knotted quality of Black life in Detroit. The church clearly acted as more than a sanctuary for religious rituals. Furthermore, neither the church nor the separate activities that occurred in it could be completely understood in isolation from one another. In light of this statement, I suggest a second major point of this presentation, that planners and designers must concern themselves with the visions of the people they serve at the level of expression those people are capable of extending. So at this point, I'll turn to describe the work that I conducted this summer. To find projects that fit those qualities that I just described, I reviewed grants made by Art Place America, the Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan, the Kresge Foundation's Arts and Culture Program, the Kresge Foundation's Detroit Program, and the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, all of which are organizations that are active in Detroit who fund community-led creative placemaking projects. I also reviewed daily and archival coverage from a number of local news outlets, including the Detroit News, the Detroit Free Press, Deadline Detroit, Metro Times, Bridge Michigan, Bridge Detroit, Model D Media, and UIX Detroit. And that was to source any projects that had been completed in the city that may not have been funded by one of those previously mentioned organizations. I specifically screened for projects conducted after the city of Detroit's municipal bankruptcy in 2013, partly to limit my own scope and also to kind of hone in on this narrative aftermath of that seismic municipal event, as well as for projects that involved changes to the physical environment. From there, I was able to connect with the community builders involved in the various projects with a response rate of about 70%. I supplemented my interview work with site visits, journaling, and mapping over 4 weeks that I was able to be in Detroit this past summer. This map here is of the outline of Detroit as well as some of the major streets, but we can see In yellow are the distribution of projects that I visited, and in blue, the geographic focus areas of the organizations responsible. And now this project, or this graphic, shows the extensive driving that I did over those 4 weeks in purple. This is a bit of a funny graphic, I'm sure, for those of you in the audience who are from Detroit or know the city, in that it probably reveals many of my own biases and preconceptions as well, if you were to study it. But the hope was to seek what James McMillan describes as turning the conceptual world, replenished, confirmed, and challenged by a perceptual world. So I had the opportunity to interview 12 community builders over the summer, each who generously reflected on their work. I'm grateful for their help, and I'm hopeful that I can do their stories justice. Unfortunately, I can only talk about 3 of the stories this evening due to time, but as my research continues, I'll be writing and thinking deeply about the work and perspectives of all 12. So I'll quickly just read the 12 people that I had the opportunity to speak with, and then we'll talk about the three stories I'd like to share with you today. So Jordan Yagiela is from Northwest Goldberg Cares. Serena Darby is from Detroit Heals Detroit. Adra Algali is from Live 6 Alliance. Christopher Robbins is from Ghana Think Tank, as well as his colleague John Ewing, who is also from Ghana Think Tank. Matt Williams is from the City of Detroit's Planning and Development Department. Karen Washington is from Emmanuel Community House. She collaborated with Pat Bosch from Nortown CDC. Shirley Birch is from Community United for Progress. Rachel Myers and Tom Habits are from Henry Ford Health System. And Roger Robinson is from the North End Woodward Community Organization. And so the 3 we'll be talking about today will be Serena Darby's work, Adra Algali's work, and Roger Robinson's work. Now, the factors that led to the selection of these 12 projects reflect, my research scope, but also its limitations, both in terms of time and just my own capacity. And this creates blind spots, and I want to acknowledge that. I want to make sure to clarify that my work is not meant to summarize or generalize across the entire body of community work or artistic practices in Detroit, nor even really a comprehensive selection of all projects relevant to my research questions. Rather than that, though, I want to elevate these stories and give them the time and thought to think deeply about them, to understand how our thinking as planners and designers might be restricted or reversely affected by our own disciplinary and personal narratives. So we'll begin by speaking about Serena Darby. Serena Darby is a Detroit educator and organizer who is the executive director of Detroit Heals Detroit, which is a youth-led organization working to foster healing justice for Detroit youth. In speaking with her, I learned about the way that they relate individual and interpersonal expression through writing, organizing, and art to a broader idea of community healing. Darby describes her own background here, saying, "I grew up in Detroit and I went to Michigan State. I got the opportunity to go back to Detroit and teach in the neighborhood in which I grew up. That was very meaningful to me. I taught in the neighborhood in which I live, so I would teach my kids and then I would go home and feed my kids." Here, by connecting the experiences of her students from home life to academic life, Darby breaks the walls of the school and situates education within the broader social context of the city. Darby then describes the origins of the organization's healing practices, which begins here in the middle of a conversation she was having with school administrators for resources to address her students' trauma. She says, "I was like, no, we need trauma counselors. And the end result from the administration was, we don't have the money. My thing is I'm really a find a way, make a way type of a person. That's always been me. So if you guys aren't going to give us the resources, then I'm going to make a way for my classroom to become a place of healing so that at the end of the year, my students can not only be academically developed, but also be developed in their characters because they healed a little bit from their trauma. For Darby, while the organization focuses first on the trauma of individual students, the need to address the roots of that trauma shifts the organization's orientation broader, which we see here where she says, one thing about our organization, we consider ourselves a social justice organization that does mental health work, because I truly believe you cannot combat the trauma in students without combating the system that creates the trauma in the first place, such as police in schools. That's traumatic for my students. Gun violence in the neighborhood, that's traumatic. So we're really big on combating systems of oppression that lead to that trauma. So here we see Darby again emphasizing how trauma strings together everyday neighborhood life with scholastic life for her students. Crucially, as we talked in our conversation, Darby also described a scaling up of healing practices. What first involved healing circles involving writing and individual expression quickly turned into organizing and collective expression. In fact, the organization's highest profile project so far, a Black Lives Matter mural painted this past June, came out of a COVID task force that the students organized with other youth-led organizations across the city. Darby says, so with the Power to the People mural on Woodward Avenue, there's this Black Lives Matter movement revived and my students really wanted to get involved. And they saw these murals popping up and were like, Ms. Darby, that's totally us. We need to be a part of that. We need to lead that. And I was like, you know what? Y'all do. I totally agree. Let's build a plan. In a really incredible passage that I'll read for you, Darby elaborates on how this project came about to be completed. She begins, once we had the first organizing call, the next step was to get in contact with someone who could actually push this from the mayor's office. But before that, Fox 2 had contacted us asking to do an interview on the story. So we did the interview, and Amy Lang from Fox 2 was like, I'm really going to make sure this happens for you guys. So she called the mayor's office on the spot, and the mayor's office was like, don't air the story. And we said, what do you mean don't air the story? I guess it would have made them look bad because they didn't already have something in place. With Detroit being one of the blackest cities in America, why wouldn't we have something that's uplifting Black people and a mural like that to be in solidarity with what other cities are going through? So Amy Lang was like, no, we're going to air the story. I had put my heart out for this story, trying to contact the mayor's office. I was emailing them, no one would get back to me. I always tell my kids, on paper, I'm the executive director, but the kids always call me the strategic organizer because I always lead with strategy. I'm really big on, okay, you guys want to do this? Let's think strategically. And I knew that going on the news would light a fire under them. Like, look, these guys weren't answering our calls, but as soon as the story aired, they were like, hello. I swear, like 3 people called me right after the story aired saying, okay, let's do this. And I said, I've been trying to get to you guys to do this for like 3 days. So yeah, that was a strategy to go on the news. And I don't know who Amy Lang talked to from the mayor's office, but I thought it was funny when they were like, don't air the story. And she was like, no, we're going to air the story. I don't know what you guys are talking about. Amy was really adamant. And so when they called us back, they were just like, we think this is a good idea. We want to partner with you guys. I told the city what we'd done this far. We have an artist who we want to do, who we want to do it. We have where we want it to be, and we spoke with the community. So this wasn't something that the city was deciding. This was Detroit Heals Detroit and their community. So the whole of Detroit was deciding. And we made it adamant, like, look, this is what Detroit says, so we need to make sure that Detroit gets what they said. This is what the community voted on. So in that story, Darby acknowledges the political barriers that often prevent citizens' access to improving their city. But the story is a success story. crucially because of the strong commitment to organizing that underlies the group's approach to healing justice. Darby says, "Our kids loved it, to go down Woodward and hopefully for years to come, to still see their work on Woodward. I think it's so powerful. And all that was a strategy, that it happened and it worked out great. I think that for our kids, it's important you have a vision and you really are committed to keep going. No one was answering our calls, but we were still going to make this happen regardless. And that's just always been my motto, find a way, make a way. I'm always going to make a way for my kids. So to see that come to fruition was very exciting." The significance of bringing artistic expression into their work for Darby is the opportunity to show her students the power of having a strong vision, strategy, and an enduring commitment. The mural, located downtown on one of the most prominent avenues in the city, becomes a lasting symbol of their healing work together, as much as it was a piece of political art for the larger city. So now Darby reflects on how the mural became part of the larger narrative of their group's ongoing work. She says, "So, I mean, coming off the mural project and having done another form of expression because the kids had just done poems, they've done visual media, artistic expression such as making videos of them reciting their poems, but to actually complete an art piece, we've only dibbled and dabbled in actual art, like painting and stuff like that. So to have a big mural to express what they believe in, I think was just so powerful and different. But also speaking for the whole city, I think a bigger thing was that this wasn't just Detroit Heals Detroit's project. The students were really speaking to the city and seeing what they want. One of our big things, and this is going to be the name of our healing hub too, this was the name of our gala, it's called Sincerely Detroit, because everything that we do is a love letter to our city. Everything we do, it's always for our city. Sincerely Detroit, a love letter to Detroit from Detroit. So yes, that's our theme for everything we do, and the mural was just the last biggest thing we've done for our love letter for the city. So the second story that I'd like to tell you all is the story that Adra Algali told me about. And now Adra's work, Adra is an urban planner and performance artist who is the program manager for Live 6 Alliance, a nonprofit planning and development organization that works to enhance quality of life and economic opportunity in Northwest Detroit. Algali joined Live 6 Alliance to lead the Detroit Neighborhood Arts Project, an effort to connect artists and community members while activating and beautifying public space in their project corridor. However, over the course of our conversation, it became clear that the project had far more pronounced impacts on both the community and Algali than simply aesthetic improvements. She begins explaining the project's origins. The Detroit Neighborhood Arts Project came to be prior to me coming on board at Live 6. The project actually lived in the Detroit Economic Growth Corporation, or DEGC, and during that time, the city was going through bankruptcy or just coming out of bankruptcy, so they didn't have it within their wheelhouse to really spearhead the project. So the funds stayed within the DEGC until the project manager at the time, Michael Forsyth, was able to move the project to a more neighborhood-based organization. And so that project just sat dormant until I was brought on. The Live 6 Alliance is a product of a partnership between the University of Detroit Mercy, the DEGC, and the Kresge Foundation. These institutional origins continue to inform the organization's approach to coalition building, which we see here as Algali describes. In the first iteration, it was really focused on artists, very hyper-local artists with ties to the community, and how we can reimagine art within the Live 6 corridor. And the second iteration brought in Mural Arts Philadelphia for a capacity building initiative in which we partnered with another Detroit-based artist, and through a series of meetings and engagement activities, we're able to put up another mural. And we are partnering with Mural Arts Philadelphia and our regional partner, Culture Source, to really put those learnings on paper within a toolkit. So we can then be able to help other organizations, whether municipalities or residents, to try and define what that sweet spot between artists and stakeholders, what that looks like for each community. She later elaborates, I see the toolkit as really being accessible for anyone, any level of government, any organization, to really just say, oh, well, you know, these are some of the things you have to do, like stuff regarding working with the city, just to be able to have a go-to point of reference. Because before, I would say not even like 5 years ago, art making in Detroit was very guerrilla style. There was no method for it. You just did what you thought you could do. And you asked for forgiveness rather than permission because there was no entity or mechanism in place where you could get that permission from. So you just did your own thing and hope it worked out. For Ogali, this capacity building element of the DNA project is meant to address past barriers to entry to participate in shaping the built environment. This is significant anecdotally in that Mayor Mike Dugan is well known to harbor strong anti-graffiti sentiments. There's a relatively recent high-profile incident in the summer of 2019 when I was working for the city's planning and development department, in which, as the administration has shifted towards embracing public art as a means of deterring vandalism, that in June 2019, resident artist Sheafy McFly, seen here, was arrested by Detroit police while he painted a commission for the city's public art mural program. If nothing else, that simply shows some of the bureaucratic barriers and difficulties in communication across the city's bureaucracy and departments. Ogali is clear to emphasize that the DNA project is not simply a means of bringing artists in to add art to the neighborhood, but rather develop mutually beneficial relationships between artists and residents. She says, I think that making sure that it wasn't just an artist or artist team that said, okay, this is what I want to do with no input, but the fact that the residents are able to see themselves in the art made it a lot easier to go through the process. And I think that this is what is missing most of the time when you have artists come into the community, because I think it's powerful being able to take a step back as an artist and reflect someone else or something else in the artwork. You have to break down your barriers in being able to see art, your art, through another individual. She continues, the art project was called What We Want because through various engagement methods, art shows and community discussions and paint parties, we kept hearing residents say, well, I want this, or I want this, or I want to see this. And then at the end of the day, the artist said, well, why don't we name this What We Want? And so the mural is a depiction of all the things he heard the residents say in terms of police representation and church and education opportunities for children right on this mural. So the DNA project then, with 7 of its 8 selected mural artists residing in the neighborhood, invests in the hypothesis that civically engaged artists of the type that Suzanne E. Smith describes in the case of King Solomon Baptist Church, that they have a role to play in strengthening their communities, not solely through the products of their work, but in the processes of that work's creation. Ogali continues, I think using art in the planning process really brought down barriers. It made it easier to talk and it allowed things to be more fluid. I feel as if art is like a way for individuals that might feel that they don't have a voice or it's hard for them to get involved, that it could be used to lift up that voice. Because you see it time and time again if you attend community meetings. You know, you have the same people at the community meetings. But if you put that whole engagement piece of art and activities, you're able to tap in a different audience, like children and those that are most often missing out of the conversation of development and planning. And you can reach a wide range of individuals. We can talk to the whole intergenerational pyramid just in terms of like, who's available, who isn't, who are we reaching, who are we not reaching? Working as a combination cultural worker and urban planner, Ogali also reflects on how her own views on planning have evolved as a result of engaging with modes of artistic expression. I think I've been able to form a practice around art and what it looks like to be represented through Indigenous peoples. And also I've tried to understand, like, how do people move through space? Because myself, I am a planner, so I tried to look at it that way, just in terms of how are we utilizing the space? What would I want to see? But I don't know. I'm continuing to reevaluate planning. I'm continuing to make sure I'm looking at planning not as the end products of planning, but as a method in which we continue to educate. And I feel that's about using people as a way to plan space, not just planners planning spaces in absence of people, but using indigenous peoples that live in that space to do the planning. Al-Ghali's reflections on the DNA project reveal a degree of nuance largely missed in popular planning literature that pushes back at generalized notions of activation and beautification and suggests a far more context and narrative-driven understanding of the value of the arts in community development, one driven by interpersonal relationships and collective deliberation. She concluded our conversation with a really great little excerpt in where she says, even when Richard Florida came out with the book and this whole movement, Who's Your City, this and that, Detroit already had that creative class, but they weren't this top social class. You know, creativity wasn't cool, so to speak. It was just something that people did, and they did it, like I said, guerrilla style. And the art in Detroit started out of necessity. And now people are like, oh, Detroit is cool in terms of art. And I'm like, no, people have been doing this forever. And I'm really anxious to see other things that I can make happen and do in terms of being an artist, but also really thinking about place as a planner, because I think we need it to have these deeper conversations. And again, like I said, it involves a whole group of people totally missed when that creative class hype came about. So for the final of my 3 stories, I'd like to tell you about my conversation with Roger Robinson, who is a business owner and leader of the North End Woodward Community Organization, or NUCO. I spoke with him about his involvement in the American Riyadh Project, a collaboration between NUCO, the Oakland Avenue Artist Coalition, of which Robinson is also a co-founder, Ghana Think Tank, Detroit Central Christian CDC, and the Detroit Justice Center. The American Riyadh Project seeks to establish a community land trust in the North End neighborhood, anchored by a riad, a Moroccan central shared courtyard. Robinson explained to me his involvement in the project's origins, saying, 10 years ago, I wound up being involved in what was then called the North End Central Woodward Governance Board. There were 6 good neighborhoods in the city that a foundation was underwriting, and the boards of those groups were actually elected in an election that was conducted by the City of Detroit Election Commission. So we actually have somewhat of a mandate. So the North End Woodward Community Organization is a continuation of that entity. When the foundation decided to pull out of the area, we decided to stay in existence. And we decided that we wanted to focus on 2 things. 1, trying to create a community land trust as an alternative development model and as a way to defend the incumbent population from the negative baggage that was likely and is now flowing from development and gentrification. And 2, job development. So those are our real focuses. Now, in my conversation with Christopher Robbins and John Ewing from Ghana Think Tank, who worked on the same project, they focused more on the creative impetus behind the riad. But Robinson comes to the project first with more strategic intentions towards advancing his visions for an alternative economic model. He says, regarding using art in community work, partly it was valid on its own. Also, there was some money available that was attached to art, so that was an incentive based on artistic organization. But in terms of creating culture, the North End of Detroit was the most significant wellspring of Black creative culture in this geography. So for me, it is an aspect of legacy, unity, and strength that I thought would be structurally and tactically prudent as an organization to play to an area of historic strength and build off that legacy strength. So I had a more political and strategic view of art, not just as art, but as part of the glue that was a legacy and part of the glue that would present itself as the basis of fortifying and strengthening community and people in community. Robinson avoids assigning too much consequence to the art itself as a community building tool. He says, the riad structure is an artifact. It's the jewelry, it's the decorative element, and a consequential one. It's a shiny object, and people like shiny objects. It's doing what I expected it would do. I think people were first questioning, what is this? Why is this? And we basically put up banners that said what it is and why it is. And they like it. There was a good faith effort to engage the community, a broken community. So it was a good faith effort. The community wasn't truly engaged because it can't be. That doesn't mean that one doesn't continue to try, but to suggest that there was community engagement other than the effort at community engagement and some very modest manifestations of that is really putting stuff in 24-point type that belongs in 6-point type. So while he does acknowledge the value behind the process of designing and constructing the riad, Robinson seems more interested in how the specific cultural context of the North End provides the basis for such a project to be successful in the first place. He states later in our conversation, "You're exploring how art plays. I think my view is somewhat different because I view that the legacy and unifying strength of Black creative culture was one of the things we had to go to in order to build. And I think that Christopher Robbins and the Ghana think tank people see it as something that is repeatable almost anywhere, and I don't believe that's the case. I do believe that you kind of had to structure an investment and put up a positive shiny object that would create a positive contour from which to help organize, but it can't create the contours in a geography unless they already were there." Robinson also makes clear his understandings of how cultural histories can provide a narrative structure on which to organize. He says, "During an earlier period, I had fought a three-year battle with the city to keep them from tearing down a building called Phelps Lounge, which I considered the most consequential building for Black culture in the city. The opening act was James Brown in '66. In '68, George Clinton opened as George Clinton and the Parliaments and closed as Parliament Funkadelic. That first night, he put his head in a bucket of water, undid his do, wrapped his head in a towel. That becomes Diaper Man. It was a 10-day booking, but that's a pretty historic thing. I think the closing act was B.B. King in '87. So I was able to get them to sell it to the Oakland Avenue Artist Coalition. They have it. At some point, I will move the ball forward when I get the American Riad project more on a trajectory towards completion. When that's concluded up, I'll be able to focus on Phelps Lounge. That then represents what I consider to be one of the major wellsprings of Black creative culture, not just in the city, but in the country." Here, Robinson is bridging past and present. He's harnessing a preservation project, not solely for the Phelps Lounge building itself, but for the broader purposes of retaining the narrative structure of the neighborhood. This is akin to James McMillan's reflection on the preservation efforts of planners surrounding decommissioned public schools in Detroit, in which he says, quote, "Objectification makes social life possible because it outlasts the fleeting ephemerality of social interaction. Intersubjective relationships partly acquire their stability through the durability of non-human things." While the social interactions Robinson describes in the Phelps Lounge are long gone, the Black cultural life that they embody is dependent on the preservation of the lounge as a physical presence in the neighborhood. Robinson continues, I believe that the political geography will in 20 years be majority non-Black, and I believe the possibility based on our work that the cultural rhythm will still flow from what was Black political and cultural institutions. I think that the population alteration based on the liquidation of 2/3 of the city's population in the last 50 years will basically guarantee that Detroit probably within the next 20 years will be less than majority Black. And this area will be part of that phenomenon. I just think that we will have cultural markers and institutions stabilized and in the ground that will be inoculated from market pressures to liquidate them, and will reinforce the Black creative cultural history, and build on that in such a way that the history and that legacy will still resonate and continue. At least that's my strategy. So here, Robinson presents a vision of the future fully in confrontation to the blank slate rhetoric discussed earlier in the presentation. Reflecting on history, political economy, and race in the neighborhood, Robinson imagines a future in which the past cannot be ignored, not from a sort of cooperation by newcomers, but by the physical presence of Black culture. He says, I think the shiny object can be used as a partial battering ram to break through. I think here it was more than that because there was a prehistory and legacy that was based on Black creative culture, and we were trying to work and navigate those contours. The major developer in the New Center area is the platform. The guy who's the major guy, his name is Peter Cummins. He's contacted Ulysses Newkirk because he wants to do something to be helpful because he's so impressed with the Riad. This is the guy who spent multi-millions of dollars in development, and tactically, we've outmaneuvered them. Amidst military rhetoric of battering rams and maneuvers, I think Robinson's comments hint at a chink in the armor of market-driven gentrification, the deeply human tendency to care. McMillan suggests that care is a commitment to neglected things, about ethical obligations in everyday laboring. Here, the Riad manages to spur a local developer to care. For Robinson, this is a strategic victory. In this way, the art of the Riad fits within Robinson's personal narratives of defending his neighborhood, attracting attention, financial resources, and ultimately legal protections against future displacement and erasure. So with that, those are my three stories. I certainly have thoughts about what we can take away from them beyond my sort of interjected analysis. But I felt it would be best to kind of leave those stories out there for all of us to kind of think about. But for now, I would really like to give my deep thanks to Dr. Thomas Reps for his generosity in helping support research like this, as well as all 12 of the community builders in Detroit who went out of their way to give me their time and also to give me insight into their reflections, often in a very personal way. I want to thank Seth Beebe, Connor Greer, Michelle Johnson, James McMillan, and Daniel Washington for their insight, and Professor Minner for her guidance over the summer in advising me. So thank you all. I'm open to questions now.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was terrific. You started by talking about how Detroit lives in a narrative superstructure, and you've just constructed a wonderful superstructure to think about the role of community, art, and planning together in that case, in 3 exciting case studies in Detroit. So that was great. I'm going to invite people to ask questions in chat and or to raise their hand in the participant list. And what I was also going to say is, while we wait for those inevitable, the little pause before the first question or so, it'll probably happen in a way, Sam, that you can pick and choose them, but I'll be happy to help. But let me ask you, while we're waiting, where do you see the arts and these communities going in Detroit, sort of this nexus of art, community, and planning, in its impacts in the city and its integration into planning process and into the communities?
Yeah, it's a good question, and unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to share his story today. But Matt Williams is a planner who I spoke with, working in the city, and his story was really interesting in that he was talking about a neighborhood plan that the department was doing that was really building on some of these different interactions and collaborations that were happening, scaling up from residents and block clubs to other philanthropic organizations and community development organizations in Detroit, and had kind of provided a playing field on which it was easy for the city, or it was advantageous for the city to be able to enter. There was already kind of work that was done and relationships that were made. And I think that's probably one of my bigger takeaways, which is that because Detroit has such a rich history of organizing, cultural organizing, political organizing, that I tried to refer to briefly, but is, you know, far more, you know, kind of vibrant than I could, you know, really communicate, that there is a sense, I think, that like there's the people doing this work in the city. Certainly I was able to find, you know, quite a lot who, you know, and those are just the people who were generous enough to give me their time and talk to me. I think kind of what's next is that for the city government, at least, they've recently appointed a director of arts and culture, which is the city's first in quite a long time. And she's, Rochelle Riley is her name, and she's really set off trying to just figure out who's doing the work and where they are, so that a lot of these sorts of barriers that I spoke about in the couple of different stories, that they can begin kind of untangling those. Because I do want to make it clear that it's not that the municipal city is standing in the way of a lot of this work. It's that there are political barriers built into the planning process, built into just municipal processes, and in a you know, a city that is still very poor, into kind of deeply into the economic fabric. And so I think it's a work in progress.
And let me ask another question then, which is, there have been efforts in a number of cities to galvanize something similar. And one of the things that strikes me is the role that children and education play versus what is the expression of, one might say, the adults. And so sometimes the art is an adult response to the situation in the community or an expression, and other times it's meant to be pedagogic, or it's meant to actually be healing, you know, healing trauma for the kids or things like that. So did you see either a conflict, or was it more the synergy of these kind of different intentions or different places in which the art arose in terms of its impact or its use or its receptivity?
Yeah, I think I had made like a deliberate choice when I was screening through different projects that were happening, or that have happened in Detroit, to not include projects in formal school curriculums. And that was really mostly because I don't have that expertise to understand that in the way that I felt like I needed to be, you know, like respectful and present and on top of the work. I think what the three stories, for example, that I've just spoken about, what they show is that there's always like different, you know, intentions, and they often do clash. You know, some of the for me, the most interesting stories, you know, of art in cities is when everyone can say on a surface level that the art is a good thing and that art is a good thing, and that you still end up with tensions or kind of, you know, conflict. I think certainly the story of Sheafy McFly being arrested by, you know, Detroit police while he was working on a city-funded mural is a great example of one of those moments where you have to take a step back and figure out how you got into that situation. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers your question, but it seems to me that the art doesn't necessarily, like it doesn't carry the values with it. It's just becoming clear, I think, to a lot of people, and a lot of people have been doing this for decades, that it's a way of communicating and creating kind of a vision of a future that's much easier to talk through with other people and much easier to kind of communicate outwards to other people than necessarily, you know, sitting in a room and having these intense deliberative debates.
So thank you. So Jenny posed 4 interesting questions on chat. And you might want to take a minute and look through, because you're invited to pick any of the 4. One about creative placemaking itself. The second is the choice of the people versus the art as a subject of discussion. The third is a comparison between Detroit, Buffalo, and Rochester. And the fourth is art and care. All great questions. So if you want to respond to those.
Yeah, I can start with the first one about the term creative placemaking. For those of you who may not know, creative placemaking is a sort of disciplinary term, I suppose, or interdisciplinary term, but it's a formalized term that's been kind of being worked on for about a decade now. That's meant to describe the integration of the arts into community development. There's many different formal definitions of it. There's a lot of institutional players who buy into the label of creative placemaking because it's a really good kind of attractor of people who are interested in the work. You know, so you do end up with people kind of who are doing this type of work, so to speak, who may say, yeah, it's creative placemaking, or they may apply for creative placemaking funding. You know, the when I worked with the Kresge Foundation's Arts and Culture program, they fund creative placemaking projects. But if you were to look at their, you know, at their grantees, you would see a whole wide kind of breadth of things they support. Everything from like housing to environmental work. So certainly far larger than, you know, any simple idea of like just getting art in cities. I think I shy away from it because, and this kind of may answer also the second question about the emphasis on the people rather than the art, is I think primarily right now my interest is in how art affects, like how doing the art affects the people who are doing it. And to me, that could be, it's an enormously broad idea in a dangerous way, right? You know, expression can be anything, you know, that's really a sort of like passionate communication. But for my sake, at this point in my research, I wanted it to be that broad. I wanted the opportunities, you know, to talk with people who may not say that they do creative placemaking, who may not say they do art at all, but have found a way to, you know, to communicate in a non-traditional way, you know, that's making this kind of change in the physical environment that's then signaling this kind of narrative shift in how they look at the future. Does that make sense, Jenny?
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really helpful.
Right. Do you want to talk a little bit more about what your sense of the, say, the art scene or the creative scene or the level of energy between Buffalo, Rochester, and Detroit is? And maybe, you know, you stressed, as did your third case study, the importance of the actual creative history of Detroit to the choice of things going forward from preservation on. But, you know, I don't think you could say there's an absence of that kind of creativity or stuff in the other cities, but rather maybe different kinds. But where do you think the level is there or the opportunities are there?
Yeah, I think I had some conversations as I was beginning the research about, you know, why Detroit, why that city? Are you open to thinking of projects from other cities that might be relevant? Are you open to, you know, thinking about even projects that might be in Hamtramck, for example, which is a municipal city within the boundaries of Detroit. So, you know, you're just talking a block off from the city of Detroit, you know, maybe you should think of that. And I think for me, there was a sense that like I wanted to stay as rigid as possible to the city, if only because I was really also trying to pull some semblance of like an understanding of how people think about collective narratives, you know, how people relate their personal narratives to that narrative of being in the city. And the, you know, the narratives there do really change across municipal lines. You know, municipal lines between the city and the suburbs are extremely racialized, extreme economic disparities, certainly political disparities as well. And so I think those would be fascinating studies. And for me, it was just completely outside of my, you know, of my reach. I really wanted to hone down on like, okay, I think I know why I've come here, but I want to understand how people are thinking about their work in relation to their city. So in terms of like these other Great Lakes cities, Rochester and Buffalo, there's really great work being done there. And I think it's worth someone doing this sort of a study to really talk with people and understand how people are thinking about their city there, you know, in relation to the work that they're doing. And that maybe there would be some kind of, you know, interesting, complex, nuanced answer then about how these cities kind of vary or are similar, or how people may think of themselves within an even larger structure. I've talked about the Great Lakes, which is really just a way for me to describe how things visually look. I can't really describe it much else. Detroit looks a lot like Rochester to me, and so it feels like a similar place. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of where I landed on it.
Great. Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions. I think there's a lot to think about in terms of what you gave us. I know I clicked on any number of your quotes and have them now on my desktop to think about even further, because it was a really provocative and interesting foray. So Sam, thank you again. Thanks to everybody who came. Thank you, John, Tom, and Marty for joining us. And you set a very nice standard for this award and for what we expect to hear now on an annual basis. So thank you, Sam.
Great. Thank you all. I appreciate your time.